the talk title today, and I'm going to read it so that I actually remember my own talk title: Awakened Living, Embracing the Sacred in Every Moment. Embracing the sacred in every moment. And I'm actually going to read the description, just the first sentence of the description, as a reminder of the conversation that we're here to have together. What if your everyday life could be a gateway to deep spiritual awakening? In this talk, I will invite you to step beyond old paradigms of striving, fixing, and surviving into a new way of being anchored in presence, purpose, and profound inner peace. And that reading from Michael Beckwith really resonated with me, and it really beautifully folds into this because he uses the phrase shake off the dust of the world. And I just love that. And also, David, when you said there's a difference between letting go, this is what I heard. I don't know if this is what you said. There's a difference between letting go of or letting go into. And that really is also something that I think is really important to pause for a moment. And what does that mean? I know in my own journey, and I often hear people saying things like, I should let that go. I need to let that go. I need to stop being so, and fill in the blank. And although that can be true, what we're inviting you to do is to realize that when you let go into the sacred, let go into the infinite wisdom that you are. And Michael went on in his reading to say, with God, all things are possible, which of course is a biblical quote. All things are possible with God. And God, of course, is one of those words that might have so many different meanings to anyone listening right now. We have our own interpretation of what that means. And I was also thinking of another quote, and quotes are funny, especially in the age of the internet, because we're not always really sure exactly who said it, but there are two quotes that came up for me during the meditation. And both of them, interestingly enough, have been attributed to either Thich Nhat Hanh or Gandhi. And it could be one of them, or it might be neither of them. But one of them is, if you don't see God in the next person you meet, you will never see God. If you don't see God in the next person you meet, you will never see God. And the other one, and I'm pretty sure this one is Thich Nhat Hanh, the miracle is not walking on water. The miracle is walking on earth and remembering the sacred nature of everyday living. That was a paraphrase, by the way. That was really my own interpretation of that quote. And so sometimes we might think that we need to create a spiritual experience, but the truth is, it's not about creation, it's about remembrance. And that's that difference between letting go of any of the stories of lack or limitation. And yes, that is true. We do get to question every idea and every belief. And going back to what Michael said, when animals experience trauma, they shake at the end. And then to allow their nervous system to go back to, because animals are pretty darn present. That's why I think we love dogs so much. There's that great meme of, the reason dogs are so happy, and there's the little bubble, and the dog is the person, the human is saying, oh my gosh, I need to answer those emails and I need to get back to work, and oh, tomorrow's Monday and I have all this to do. And the dog's bubble head is, isn't it wonderful being here with my human? And that to me is the perfect way to demonstrate the embodiment of seeing everything as sacred. And yeah, maybe we have been taught that the miracle is walking on water, but the truth is, miracles are actually all around us. Our very body is such a miracle. Everything, nature. We talked about the sunset earlier, to see the sunset and to be in the energy of that sunset and to notice the emotion that that evokes. That emotion, that feeling is the remembrance of who and what we are. So, yes, maybe we do let go of, but the deeper opportunity for us is to let go into the sacred remembering of who and what we are. And so if something in the world affects us, because in that reading too, Michael didn't say all things are possible with God and the conditions of the world will not happen. It was that the conditions of the world will have no power over me. I remember when I was early in Unity, there was someone who said, germs aren't real, I don't believe in them. And I thought, well, it's an interesting point of view. I think I might say, here's this thing we call germs that, yes, it does create this thing that we call illness or disease. What if I realized there was something within me that was more powerful than that germ? Now, that's a different way of framing what a lot of us in New Thought maybe have done. And that is, let me change my thinking so I can change the conditions of the world. I want to manifest more so that I can be fill in the blank. I want to manifest the perfect relationship so that I can be happy. I want the world to not be having so much conflict so that I can be at peace. And of course, at Unity, we say, peace begins with me. And the truth is, peace begins and ends with me because, as Pema Chodron says, if you're looking for stability and predictability, you were born on the wrong planet or you've come to the wrong place, right? Because things in the outer world we know are constantly changing. We'll always have an opinion about that. Now, maybe some of you have gotten to a point where you don't have opinions about everything. But for me, I noticed that's just what my mind does. And I spent 20 years in New Thought trying to change the thinking. And at one point, I realized there's something much greater as a possibility. Well, even easier, let's put it that way. Thank you for sharing. The mind is doing what it does. It is sorting and separating and judging. It is constantly deciding who and what is safe. There's a greater power within me that's beyond the thought that I have about this. Source energy is who and what I am, and that great remembrance allows me to realize that the conditions of the world do not create my peace. The conditions of the world do not create my love. And as we've been talking about for many months here together, that's where we shift from the law of attraction to the law of radiance. We shift from I'm going to create my perfect life to I'm going to move into the great remembrance or the great remembering. And this may sound like semantics, but it's a very different way to live because so many of us might be looking for that moment where we find God or find source or find love or find enlightenment. To realize that we came in as a spark of divinity, and that's the truth of who and what we are, is a very different way of being. And in a moment, in one single breath, I can take a breath and remember that truth. And remembering that truth may or may not change the conditions of the world. And we'll come back to that in a moment because may or may not is an important distinction. The key here, though, is I don't need it to change the world in order for me to be free. I don't need the world to be different in order to know that I am love. There is nothing to attract. And as my friend Amitabh in one of his songs says, we can call off the search and rest in the truth of who and what we have always been. And to call off the search for some of us is a very different way of being because we may have been searching and searching and searching, either for that spiritual experience, that love that will make us feel complete, the hope that something might be different. Or we can say, I am choosing to call off the search and remember who and what I am. And then we rest in that first principle of unity. There is only one power and one presence. And if that is true, then I get to see the sacred in everything. Now, I will confess, it is easier for me to see the sacred quite often in a beautiful child who is laughing or a couple in love holding hands. It's easy to see it in a sunset. But what about in traffic? Or what about when a political figure does or says something, which in today's world, we don't even know if they actually said it. I love the meme that goes around on April 1st, on April Fool's Day, that says, April 1st, the one day we fact checked everything that we read on the internet. And I think that's hilarious, right? Because I see what people are posting and I'm like, isn't it interesting that someone else I know posted the exact opposite about this one situation? So moving beyond the conditions of the world moves beyond the idea of rightness and wrongness. What it doesn't mean for me is that I say it's okay, all of this is happening, or I'm going to uh, practice the spiritual bypass. And it's interesting, spiritual bypass, because in my, we many of us have been hearing about spiritual bypass for many, many years. I know I wrote about it in my first book that came out in 2015, and someone posted today, what's this spiritual bypass thing I'm hearing about? Can someone please explain? And I actually had someone send me a private message that said I was in spiritual bypass because I wasn't outraged about what's happening politically. And to pretend that I'm not outraged is a spiritual bypass. So I want to lean in a little and say what spiritual bypass means to me. To me, a spiritual bypass is when I pretend like the conditions of the world aren't happening. And I say everything is love and light, and I only focus on the positive. I was actually involved in a community that was deeply entrenched in that, and no one was allowed to talk about a diagnosis like cancer, like you never talked about it. They would say, cancel, cancel. And we all wore the rubber bands, and you'd flick your wrist if you said something negative because the universe might get you. Interesting. It's just new words for the same old idea of a punishing God. We might call it karma, or in New Thought, we might call it the cosmic two by four. Spiritual bypass is pretending that something's not happening. To me, that's really very different than saying I should be outraged by what's happening, because the outrage creates more of the same. If I understand the great remembering of who and what I am, and this is where I'm going to come back to, it actually does ultimately change the conditions of the world. To me, it's one of the greatest paradoxes. I stopped trying to change the world so I could be free, and I cleared and cleaned and looked at all the things within myself. Like Rumi says, our job is not to seek for love, but to look at the barriers we put on top of it, or what has prevented me from remembering who and what I am. And in that great remembrance, we radiate that into the world and realize there's nothing to attract. And lo and behold, the world seemed to change instantly. It doesn't mean that the war is not happening in the Middle East. It doesn't mean there aren't things that I personally want to contribute however I can in consciousness to change it. But if I am uh, coming from a place of the world is broken and I'm here to fix it, first of all, it's exhausting. And secondly, it creates more of that. So, what do we actually do? For me, I remember who and what I am, a spark of divinity like every other living being. I realize there is sacred in every situation, whether that's a diagnosis or a conflict or seeming division. And I ask, what's the highest possibility here? And my intention every day is to start my day with gratitude. Thank you for the awareness that there is something within me that's so greater than any condition I will experience today. Grateful. And the second thing I ask myself is to remind myself and ask, how can I serve today? Now, what does that mean? How can I serve today? I'm going to quote Michael Beckwith again because he says, we're not here to save the world, we're here to serve the new paradigm. And when I first heard him say that, it kind of shot through me, but then I spent some time contemplating it. So what does that actually mean? I'm not here to save the world, because if I'm here to save the world, I'm saying that it needs saving, that it's broken, that there's something fundamentally wrong. And of course, we can find plenty of evidence to say, but it is. It is. There are all these things that are happening. To serve the new paradigm is to realize who and what I am and be a reminder of that in the world. And in my experience, that's actually the only thing that creates lasting change on the planet. In other words, shame does not heal shame, hate does not end hate, and war does not end peace. And yet, many of us have been conditioned to believe that's true. And what I want to acknowledge is having compassion for that programming, because it does seem that fighting has brought us some progress in the world. That progress, however, is very limited, and that's part of that pendulum that swings. And so rather than being kind of a victim to the, and I don't love that word, but let's say the condition of the pendulum draws me off center or takes me off center, I remember that in the midst of this, I can be the sacred presence. And all that's required of me is to remind myself of that on a moment to moment basis, let go into that, and maybe also let go of all the stuff that I have believed that has kept me limited or kept me from experiencing that. And a wise person once said, it can take a lifetime and it can happen in an instant. And those moments when we remember who and what we are, those moments, that spontaneous insight, love is who I am, peace is who I am. I am a spark of this divinity. I have moved this first principle of unity from an intellectual understanding down into an embodiment of this principle. There's only one power and one presence active in the universe and in my life. And if that's true, then that must mean that there's a spark of divinity in every situation in the world. And I really thought my mind was going to understand that at some point. I thought my mind was going to be able to, yes, that's true. In my experience, some moments my mind can rest and I can feel that very deeply. And sometimes my mind is at odds with that. Yeah, but what about that? That can't be a spark of divinity. This is something happening that's horrible. Compassion for self, understanding for the programming, for the reactive impulse, for the part of me that believes there's something to defend. And then in a moment, I can take a breath and remember. In the midst of this, I have a role. And my role is to be at odds with this, or my role is to be a presence for love, a presence for peace, a presence for God, source, infinite beingness, whatever word we use. And that to me is what it means to have every day an awareness of the everyday sacred nature. And so the invitation really is quite simple. Question every idea I've ever had that is counter to this great knowing, rest in this great reality, and remember, because our body does remember. My body does remember those moments. You know, we might have these, what we call a peak experience, or this moment where we know there's only love. I've had quite a few in my life. And then maybe the next decade, I try to figure out how it happened or what just happened. Or even more so, I might figure out how to make that happen again. And instead, we can let go into this awareness and this knowing. Can it be that simple? Can it be as simple as I know who and what I am? And if I know who and what I am, I know that every living being is a spark of this divinity. I remember being in Egypt, and it was Ramadan. And for those of you who don't know what Ramadan is, part of it is they don't eat all day. And when the sun goes down, they have their first meal. And so people who don't have the means to have their first meal, there are in the public places, there are these long tables where people get fed because it's very important to share that meal and to share that sacred eating after this day of fasting. And my friend Kealoha and I were walking, and we were in Cairo, and we walked around a corner, and there was a young boy, probably 9 or 10 years old, and he had a plate of food, and the sun had just gone down, and we watched him go over and sit down. He hadn't had a bite of food yet, and he saw us, and his first instinct was to reach his plate out so that we could have the first bite. That to me is what it means to see the sacred in every moment. That simple act of love, that kindness that this young person, we didn't take the first bite, by the way. I don't know if he might have, maybe that was offensive. I don't know. But of course, we were like, no, please eat. You know, we're just Americans who have been eating all day long, right? So, but it was a beautiful demonstration. And so, what I want to close with really is an invitation to ask, is it possible to have it be as simple as every glance, every thought, every emotion, and every experience in my body can be infused in this and as this energy of love. Is it possible that at every moment I can ask myself, what is the sacred opportunity here? What is the highest possibility for me to see? How can I serve this new paradigm of oneness, this new paradigm that love is all there is, that in the midst of anything happening in the world, I can stand clear. I can call off the search. I can realize that there's nothing to fight for and there's nothing to fight against. I can stand in this greater reality because life is a great experiment. And my invitation for you is to go out into the world, being this frequency of love and see what happens. And at any moment, if you find yourself forgetting that truth, just take a breath. I know who and what I am. I know who and what you are. We are love. And then we get to see what happens. What an adventure this life is to walk on the earth and to be at peace and to remember this is the greatest miracle possible. And each of us gets to do that on a moment to moment basis. As always, I'm so grateful to have been with you. Peace and blessings, everyone.